First of all, let me welcome all our participants today. And on behalf of the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization, the International Islamic University Malaysia, let me welcome our guest of honor, Professor Dr. Anthony Booth, for accepting to deliver our 33rd Istac World Professorial Lecture. It's really a wonderful time and moment to have him with us here with his vast experience and knowledge on the area of Islamic analytical philosophy. In fact, I have to mention here that the Istac World Professorial Lecture is a very well-known professorial lecture in our university, country, and also in many other parts of the world. And today, our professorial lecture is number 33. For the information of our participant and audience today, the World Professorial Lecture contributed by great scholars, distinguished figures, and eminent persons, including the Prime Minister, the late Prime Minister of Japan, including many ambassadors from the West and the East, including philosophers, scholars, researchers, and including many other experts from the United Nations and UNESCO before. So in our professorial lecture today, we are very much honored to have Professor Anthony with us. Let me just add that I came to know Professor through Brother Abdul Rahman Yahya, who is a Saudi young promising scholar and philosopher whom I met last year in Riyadh International Conference on Philosophy, in which many great scholars and philosophers from almost all parts of the world participated discussing issues related to the importance of philosophy and its relevance to quality of life. It was really wonderful to see many scholars, Muslim and non-Muslim, and many philosophers contributing to the development of philosophy there in Riyadh. It's really a great initiative. So thank you very much indeed, Brother Abdul Rahman, for linking us and connecting us with Professor Anthony. And as you see in the poster and in the promotion, Professor Anthony will be speaking about Islamic analytical philosophy and its relevance. He will choose the parts that he believes will be relevant to our discussions, and we hope to have more and more discussions. So with this welcoming remarks, once again, I welcome our participants and scholars who are with us here in the Zoom and in the YouTube channel of the Institute. Welcome to our 33rd Istac World Professorial Lecture. I leave it to Assistant Professor Dr. Nurul Ain Norman, who is our Head of Research and Publication at the Institute, to introduce our scholar and moderate the professorial lecture. Go ahead, Professor Nurul Ain.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Honorable Dean, Professor Abdul Aziz. Very good. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Distinguished guests, respected colleagues, students, and seekers of knowledge, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. With utmost gratitude to Allah, the All-Knowing, we begin today's 33rd Istac-Iium World Professorial Lecture under the illuminating theme Analytical Islamic Philosophy and its Contemporary relevance. It is both an honor and a responsibility for us at Istac to serve as a platform for reviving profound conversations where reason and revelation are not in opposition, but in harmony. And today's session is a testimony to this divine promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Utul Ilm Darajat. And it is with great joy that I welcome all of you, especially our distinguished guest speaker, a scholar whose work represents the very dialogue this forum seeks to ignite between Islamic traditions and analytic philosophy. And allow me to introduce Professor Dr. Anthony Robert Booth, Professor of Ethics and Epistemology at the University of Sussex, United Kingdom. Prof. Booth is not only a seasoned scholar in the epistemology of belief and ethics, but a bridge builder between the analytic Western philosophical tradition and the rich intellectual heritage of Islam. He received his PhD from the University of Durham in 2006 and has since contributed significantly to the understanding of how beliefs ought to be formed, especially through what he calls moderate evidentialism. His notable works include Islamic philosophy and the ethics of belief and analytic Islamic philosophy. And in these works, he boldly challenges the dismissive legacy left by thinkers such as Russell, and he positions Islamic philosophy as a living tradition of reason, of critical inquiry, and ethical integrity. And today he will guide us through how Islamic philosophers like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Al-Ghazali, and Averroes still speak meaningfully to today's moral, political, and epistemological dilemmas. And without further ado, I give the floor to him, and the floor is yours, Honorable Professor.
Thank you ever so much. Thank you for that. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Perfect. Just checking. Okay, so, well, good afternoon, Kuala Lumpur, and good morning to all of those who are in the UK and to everybody else in the world. Hello, I suppose. Marhaba. I just want to extend my enormous thanks to the organizers, Professor Abdelaziz, especially. The work of Istac I've been following is incredible. It's such incredible work. And the lectures that have been given hitherto on this lecture course have been of an outstanding quality. And I'm just so unbelievably honored to be giving this one, the 33rd of those lectures. I also want to give a special thanks to one of my perhaps best ever students, Abdul Rahman, who's here with us today. Lovely to see you. It's so honoring to me when some of my students do well, and in the case of Abdul Rahman, sometimes understand my work. Sometimes I think better than even I do, which is just such a joy to see. And I have to say that hitherto, hopefully, inshallah, I don't think I've ever offended any Muslim scholar of Islamic philosophy. But I seem to have some people that are mainly Anglo-American intellectual historians who really have an issue with my an issue with my work. And so it's especially lovely for me to see young people engage with me so comprehensively. I sometimes despair a bit that my generation, there isn't that much hope for people of my generation and for people that are older than me to really enact change, such as that the positions are just a little bit too entrenched. There's just a little bit too much ego involved, careers, etc., etc. So it's to the young generation that I personally harbor the most hope for. So with that said, I will move on to begin the discussion. So thank you ever so much. A tremendous honor for you to have me. I will start sharing my screen if I can try to. Okie dokie. Right. Um,
Can you, Prof?
I'm having some trickiness. Apologies, I don't think I can. Oh, hang on, here it is. Can people see the screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I will begin the slideshow then. Okie doke. Okay, so there's, of course, an enormous number of problems that the world faces today, but here are a few of them. So I think there's perceived to be at least an overabundance of information that's available to everybody today. Artificial intelligence software enables almost anyone to create so-called deep fakes and make them widely available to everybody. Traditional institutions that used to be they used to curate information to the public, such as, excuse me for using my own example, in my country, the BBC in the UK, look like they're increasingly losing their influence. And as a result, people are uncertain about whom to trust, what sources of information to trust, what to believe, and leading some to claim that we're even entering an era of post-truth. And the world is concomitantly, economically becoming more dependent as globalism marches on, seemingly inexorably. But we're also witnessing the growth of tribalism, identity politics, nationalist ideology, together with the erosion of liberal institutions that had preserved perhaps a modicum of peace hitherto, and a rise in really atrocious violent conflict. So overall, the world looks insecure, uncertain, unpredictable, a world that evokes the feelings of fear, perhaps, of disaffection, of misalignment of values. My claim for today is that the medieval school of Islamic philosophy, falsafa, with some of the notable, that encompasses some of the notable thinkers that were mentioned earlier by Nurul Ain, has some instructive things to say to us here. Imagine that's of no surprise to anybody tuning in today. My perhaps more controversial claim is that treating this school from this perspective on analytic philosophy, so analytically, as it were, kind of just helps us unlock those lessons from medieval philosophy. So let me start by trying to say what I mean by what is it to say that one is engaging in these historical texts analytically. So here are a few things that I think it means. Um, so to say that one's engaging in a historical thinker or a historical period like this analytically, I think is to say uh, these things. It's to be committed to a kind of rational reconstruction of what a particular author, such as Al-Kindi or Al-Farabi, who we'll look at in a minute, were saying, and to apply the principle of utmost charity to those works. So you're engaging in them, as it were, to try to make sense of their texts, to reconstruct what they're thinking in such a way that their texts make as much sense as possible. Okay, you're not there to kind of put them down, but to, in other words, try to make their version of what they're saying be the strongest possible version as you see it. So this contrasts. Um, I guess the motivation really is not just what we might call piety for the history of philosophy. One's not just doing history of philosophy here for the sake of just reconstructing the history, but rather with the thought that we might learn things from the historical text that would kind of help us with the problems of today. intellectual problems or perhaps political or ethical problems. And this contrasts to what I think is called, or it's become very well known as the Cambridge School of Intellectual History, spearheaded by people such as Quentin Skinner, and where a lot of people who have been working in intellectual Islamic history, so who have kind of preserved in a way the tradition of Islamic philosophy, at least in the West. So it's that tradition that they've sort of been coming from. So the Cambridge School of Intellectual History really, I would say, can be characterized by, for me, by two positions. The first is that they think that there are no perennial, genuine philosophical questions. Okay? So they think that there are only philosophical questions that are germane to a particular context of history. So there isn't a kind of to them a universal claim, for instance. To me, I think it's a perennial philosophical question of if God is fundamentally indivisible, how may we know him? I think that to me, that's a perennial philosophical question that stands the test of time. Okay, that every age will have to grapple with in some form or another. The language to describe it may be different. The political context in which those questions may arise may be different, but it's something that each age will have to think about. And there are many such problems. The Cambridge School thinks there are none. Incidentally, they're mainly influenced here by the work of the later Ludwig Wittgenstein, who thought there weren't really any philosophical problems. The old philosophical problems were pseudo problems that were caused by the vagaries of our using language. So if we attended to how we use language carefully, the problems would disappear. So they don't think there are really genuine philosophical problems. All there are individual thinkers, individual issues that particular historical contexts arise, and there are intentions that the particular thinkers had. And the historian's job is to dissect and find out what those specific intentions are. So I disagree with that. Okay, so I think I'm not going to engage in an argument with why I would disagree with them, but I'm just characterizing the analytic flavor here is to think that there are genuine, perennial, as they put it, philosophical questions, and that's really what's motivating. If we think about what the intentions are of these authors, is really what's motivating and at the heart of their thought, and to understand what's really at the heart of their thought, one has to treat these questions seriously. And as such, I think that it's the overall analytic tradition, analytic approach to Islamic philosophy is to treat Islamic philosophy as just more than an item of just curious exotica. Okay, that it can be accessible to those and entered into those that aren't kind of just initiated into a class by those who could do close textual analysis and philology, that then have to know Arabic and Syriac or ancient Greek and so many different kind of barriers to trying to understand the text. I think that's a kind of way, covert or perhaps even deliberate way, of leaving a lot of people out of being able to engage with the tradition. Okay, it becomes this just a historical artifact that only a very select few, can really meaningfully discuss. And that's partly why I think that you haven't seen so much Islamic philosophy discussed in mainstream Anglo-American philosophical curricula, because those who have sort of curated the discipline have made it such that it's so difficult for anybody to engage with. They've got to know all these different languages. They've got to spend hours and hours and hours on the philology and the close textual analysis that nobody can ever really engage into it. And as such, I think the philosophy then becomes a little moribund. Again, it's something that only a very respectable few, perhaps in a Cambridge college, can discuss over a kind of port. It's a sort of moribund item of a strange curious thing that once happened in the Islamic past. And I don't think that's the best way of engaging in this tradition. And I also think that it's more appropriate to treat Islamic philosophy analytically, as it might be if we think about how we're going to engage in mathematics. Okay, there doesn't seem to be anything racist or pejorative in saying that we can do African history. But to my ear, at least, there seems something pejorative about talking of African mathematics, right? Now, one might say when we're thinking about African mathematics, what we're really just talking about is the historical mathematics that was done in the continent of Africa. But that just seems to me, well, perhaps a noble pursuit, historically speaking. But it leaves something importantly out, does it not? Something important out of mathematics. If one is just approaching mathematics historically, it seems like psychologism has gone rife, right? That there's something missing about the way in which you're engaging in mathematics if you're just treating it historically. So there's something strange about doing African mathematics. And so it should sound then, if mathematics is a kind of an allied tradition to philosophy as an a priori discipline, to thinking of philosophy historically. Okay, and that's why I like to insert the term analytic Islamic philosophy here, because I want to showcase that we're trying to do with it, to treat it from first principles. Okay, so the thought really in the end is to think that it's a really simple one, ultimately, is that we don't want to think of the thought of a perhaps distant tradition, such as speaking from somebody from the West, that if we're trying to engage in a tradition that's different to the Western one, that it's going to be something completely different and esoteric and a completely different way of thinking. The basic point is that all humans essentially think pretty similarly. And we'll see in lots of different traditions that they've come up with not all that dissimilar positions. Okay, so that it's not, so that we don't, it's not, Islamic philosophy isn't something that's just incomprehensible from a Western perspective. Okay, we're not otherize. I think that helps us not to otherize each other so much. Now the issue is then, well, aren't we perhaps facing the danger of co-option and triangulation? There is a danger of trying to make Islamic philosophy be something that's just co-opted by the Western tradition, that as it were, that the new analytic Western tradition of philosophy is somehow the true inheritor of the Islamic tradition. And while sometimes there's a sort of temptation to me sometimes to see such a close connection, in particular with the Islamic tradition on the fundamental position that mathematics takes in both art and culture, and especially in philosophy, that in analytic philosophy traditionally too, with its emphasis on mathematics, that there is a kind of real convergence of thought here. But the point isn't to try and say somehow that analytic philosophy is the way to understand Islamic philosophy. And it's not to try and say that somehow it's been co-opted within that tradition. The point is really just to try and show respect to that tradition, and by showing it that it can help us make progress with our philosophical problems in its difference. Okay, so it's not something that's so different that we can't understand at all without putting ourselves in it. but it's not something that's just identical and we don't need to engage in because we can just do first order analytic philosophy. Okay, there's enough similarity that we can engage in it, but there's enough difference that it helps us to make progress because it's that little bit different with contemporary philosophical problems. So again, the main aim is to show maximum respect here. Okay, so hopefully that foregrounds in some way what the analytic approach is to taking these historical texts. So let me see some of this in action. Let's see some of this in action. Okay, so here's a position I call Islamic evidentialism. Okay, now this is a way I've characterized a particular way of thinking about this part of the tradition. Now, it's sometimes some of the things I want to say here, but not exactly, sometimes go under the purview of rationalism. Now, I prefer evidentialism for a number of different reasons. One of which is that it's sometimes confusing to a philosophical audience to talk about rationalism because there's a debate between the rationalists and the empiricists in the Western tradition, say between Descartes and Locke and Berkeley, Hume, these sorts of people. And I don't think when people are talking about Islamic rationalism, they mean to take a side on that debate, although there is a correlate debate within Falsafa that is about the empiricism and rationalism as the West sees it debate. So I think just to make things less confusing, I prefer the term evidentialism. And there's a number of other reasons why I prefer the term, but let's stick with it for now. Now, I think this view I associate with the early Kalam Mutakallimun, the theologians of the early Kalam, and the very first of the Islamic philosophers, notably Al-Kindi, who were all working under, of course, the Abbasids. And to me, evidentialism is a thesis about what justifies belief. So when we're talking about beliefs here, I'm not quite talking about how we should form beliefs, but rather I'm thinking about the question of what ought we to believe? Okay, I think we can all try and grasp that question, right? What should you believe right now? Right? So that's the central question. What should you believe? Okay. And evidentialism, Islamic evidentialism, gives you this answer, that the only things that can determine the question of what you ought to believe are considerations to do with the truth. Okay. So once you've settled that something is true, there is no further question about whether you ought to believe it. Settling the question of whether something is true is to settle whether or not you should believe it. So if you're thinking, I want to know whether I should believe it's raining, and I look out the window and I see that it's raining, that already settles for me the question of what I should believe, namely that I should believe that it's raining, because it's true that it's raining. Okay. So other considerations, such as whether it would be in your interest to believe it, whether it would make you happy, whether it would further your life advances, or whether somebody else has instructed you to believe something, okay, as per theological voluntarism, perhaps, those are irrelevant. Okay, those shouldn't settle what you should believe. Only the truth does. Now, this, I think, is of a piece with the Mutazilite view that there are these two central things. If you want to know what the nature of God is, one needs to look at these two things. These are the two primary central things about God, that God is one, of course, the Tawhid, and that God is just. The thought was that there is one God, and what one God means in this context is that there's one set of moral principles that applies to all the tribes. Well, not just all the tribes, so not just to the Arabs, but to all of humankind. There isn't one set of moral truths for those who are rich and a different set of moral truths for those who are poor. There isn't one set of moral truths for a particular tribe and a different set of moral principles for another. There is one set of moral principles for everybody. And that because they're for everybody, and not just to the Arabs, for all of humankind, they have to be public and publicly verifiable. So evident, and evidence is something that's publicly verifiable. Okay. Now, I won't talk about this too much, but I think also in the history of thought, this sort of position, I think actually really extremely radical at the time, and I think in a way it continues to be. But it's the first place really we see in intellectual history a place for belief to be something that's internal, a kind of internal mental representation of the world. So this contrasts to what was then Orthodox Christianity, and perhaps its credo here that I've got on the slide, lex orandi est lex credendi, that the law of belief is the law of prayer. Now, for the Orthodox Christianity there, the law of belief is the law of prayer. Liturgy, the way one practices one's faith, was all important. Belief, in a way, the law of belief is the law of prayer, is the law of prayer. Belief is nothing but actions. So if belief is really a type of action, or a set of different actions, then how you evaluate belief will be kind of non-epistemically. You'll evaluate belief in terms of whether it leads to good actions. Actions are the sort of thing that you can say are good or bad, or instrumentally useful or not. You can't say that. You can't really judge actions and whether or not they are true. It seems a total category mistake to judge an action on its truth. Actions aren't true or false. They're not the sorts of things that are capable of being true or false. It's inner representations that are capable of being true and false. So by insisting on the truth, there's also a kind of metaphysics of the mental, whereby we've got these inner representational states. So our beliefs are these inner representational states that are correct when they rightly represent the world. In other words, when they correctly represent the world, when they truly represent the world. Okay, but I'll move on from that point. So here's Al-Kindi here in a famous passage from his magnum opus on first philosophy, that he says, "We must not be ashamed to admire the truth or to acquire it from wherever it comes, even if it should come from far-flung nations and foreign peoples. There is, for the student of truth, nothing more important than the truth. Nor is the truth demeaned or diminished by the one who states or conveys it. No one is demeaned by the truth, rather all are ennobled by it." So I think Al-Kindi is doing two things here. If he's trying to sell to his Muslim audience that one ought to engage in what was then Greek philosophy, because if there was something to be true to be found in studying these texts, then it would in fact be counter-Islamic to go and study it, because what's important about Islam is to be a truth seeker. Okay, so here we've got a clear commitment to what I think is called, what I'm calling here, evidentialism, the thought that what has normative authority ultimately, why you should believe in God. So the question is, why should you believe in God? Why should you believe there is only one God? And the answer is because it's true. The normative authority is the truth here. What brings it about that you should believe it is the fact that it's true. Okay. Hopefully that's clear to people. It's sometimes strange because I don't have much of an audience here to gauge how things are landing, but I'll just carry on. Okay, now this issue. So here's the evidentialist position. What's got the most normative, the normative basis for our beliefs is the truth. Okay, now this absolutely had some very salutary upshots. For you must be able to imagine a world where there was no prophet, and the prophet tells us he is the prophet. Okay. Why should we believe him? Why should anyone have believed him at the time? Okay. Clearly, there are false prophets that will also tell us that they are prophets. So how can we, who are mortal and not the cleverest beings in the universe, how can we tell apart the true prophet from the false prophet? Somebody just telling us that they are, well, that's what the false prophets do too, right? So the basis of why we should believe it can't be just their authority, because how do we tell apart their authority from other people's authority? And evidentialism gave us a good answer for that. And here's the view, the position called as verisimilitude, in other words, closeness to the truth, what word just means. So because what justifies belief is evidence, everything that the prophet says can be independently verified against the evidence. So we can tell apart the true prophet from the false prophet because we take everything that they say, we test it against the evidence. If it's true, we know that that's the true prophet. We can always test out the genuine prophet from the false prophet, right? And moreover, this, because evidence is then public, this also explains the political aspect of Islam. Because if it's going to be a political religion from the off, then the political has to be something that's public and available for everybody. Okay. But here the problem arises. Now, if everything that is in prophecy can be verifiable against the evidence, okay, such that we can test it against the evidence, we can use our rational brains, sometimes in doing the maths, figure it out for ourselves, and it's public, the test of prophecy is public, then why would God have sent down a Quran? All we needed to do, we didn't need a prophet. All we needed to do was engage our minds and look out into the world, into the evidence that he'd already given us. Why did there need to be a prophet? Why did God send down a Quran to us if that's all we needed to do? So here's a more kind of technical way of thinking about it, that there has to be something epistemically unique about prophecy. That is, there has to be something new that we learn through reading the prophecy. Okay. And if there's nothing in it, if everything in it is exoteric, so not esoteric, so anything can be accessible via the evidence and tested out against our public evidence, so not esoteric, there is nothing epistemically unique about it. There's nothing that I could learn just by reading the Quran. Okay, so this is the point about being as epistemically unique. There has to be something that you learn only by reading the Quran. And if there isn't anything that you learn only by reading the Quran, it seems like there's nothing epistemically unique about it. And the question arises, well, why would God send down the Quran? Why would we have a prophet if evidentialism was true? So here's the problem. And I think this is a problem in my mind is really at the heart of all the different thinkers in the Falsafa tradition that are dealing with it in their different, interestingly different ways. Okay. Now, one of the interesting things that I find here is that I think that this problem is structurally identical to one that's addressed in very contemporary epistemology about how we can determine when an expert is really an expert. Okay, so imagine you have, without obviating the purpose of expertise. So you can imagine an expert witness, perhaps at some trial, and they're an expert, say they become an expert in quantum mechanics. For some reason, you need to have an expert at a trial that's an expert in quantum mechanics. And you, the jury, well, you're not sure whether you trust the expert. How do I know that this expert's really the expert? Okay. I don't trust their credentials. I want to know whether they really are talking what they say is true. Well, one way we could test it is to learn quantum mechanics ourselves, right? Okay. So and then we know, now that I've learned all of the quantum mechanics, I know that you were telling me the truth, and I know that you were the true expert. But at that point, I've learned quantum mechanics, right? And I no longer need the expert to tell me what they believe because I've learned everything that they've learned, such in order to verify them. But I've learned everything that they've learned, so I no longer need them. So here's the issue, and here's why I was bringing this up earlier on. It's the issue of how do we determine expertise without rendering it obsolete? Maybe there is a reason why we have experts and why we might want experts. But how is it? It's an interesting issue. How do we identify them in such a manner that doesn't render them obsolete? Okay, so that's, I think, the same problem here, because we can think of the Prophet in a way as an expert with regards to spiritual matters. So how do we know that they're really the expert without rendering them, as it were, obsolete? Okay. Now, here's some solutions that we might find in sort of contemporary analytic epistemology. Okay, epistemology being the theory of knowledge here. Okay, so a layperson, so here's somebody called Alvin Goldman, who's the late Alvin Goldman, I should add, who was an American philosopher working primarily in the 20th century. Now, he thinks that an expert can be identified by the layperson, by the non-experts, kind of indirectly, because the expert exhibits these sorts of traits that they can, they exhibit the presentation of more ostensive rebuttals to counter evidence. Okay, they respond more quickly to counter evidence, and they kind of have smoother responses to counter evidence. Okay, so these are indirect signs without ourselves having to be the experts in something to determine the expert. We can look at these indirect signs that an expert is really saying the truth, or speaking the truth. That they're going to be better at engaging when you present them with counter evidence to their claims. They're going to be better at dealing with that effectively. In other words, they're going to be more dialectically skilled because now we're engaging in a conversation with them by presenting them counter evidence or counter arguments. Okay, so they're going to be more dialectically skilled. Okay, and he's talking here about the smoother responses. They're going to have kind of a rhetorical facility too. So, the thought is that somebody who really knows their stuff will also be a good teacher. They'll be able to teach those things that they really know very well. Now, the problem here is that they'll be able to explain the knowledge that they have well. But there's something, the problem that I think Goldman faces, and why I think analytic philosophy is kind of stuck with this issue, a deep issue, is that, well, there doesn't seem to be, at least in the Anglo-American notion of knowledge, which I think is slightly different to the Arabic notion of knowledge, actually, in important ways. But I'll park that thought for a moment. That there isn't a principled link, at least in the way we think of knowledge in English, between knowing something and being dialectically skilled and rhetorically skilled at explaining it. So here we can think of some, to use an Anglo-American, slightly pejorative, but now used in the non-pejorative way, of being a geeky kind of person. Okay, so we can imagine somebody who sits at the computer all day, is a very geeky kind of person, knows everything there is to know about quantum physics or what have you, but they've got a tremendous knowledge, but they're absolutely incapable of explaining that knowledge to somebody else. In the English notion of knowledge, that makes sense. That can happen, right? That seems to fit with our conception of knowledge. Okay, so there's no principal links. So if that's true, if there is no link, no principal link between rhetorical and dialectical ability and knowledge of a particular proposition, then it doesn't seem like we can identify the experts indirectly, because somebody who's really good dialectically and rhetorically might not have the underlying knowledge, or somebody who's got lots of knowledge might not be good at explaining it. Okay. So there's a missing link there in the Anglo-American tradition, and that throws up all sorts of problems for us. Okay, now I want to now go to one of the falasifa of the falsafa tradition, Abu Nasr al-Farabi, okay, who I think has, in my view, the most elegant solution to this. Now, returning to putting it more in a theological context of what is it that's epistemically unique about prophecy. Now, in my reading of this, and I'll say already, I'll warn you that this is maybe some Western scholars don't like my interpretation of Farabi here, but I'll give it to you nonetheless. I think he thinks of prophecy as what I would call here an emancipatory worldview, where a worldview, importantly, has two components. Okay, it has true propositions. Okay, so a worldview. So prophecy is a view of the world that contains in it statements about the world that are true. But it also not only contains true proposition, it tells us how the truths of the world in a kind of narrative context hang together. It, in a way, narrativizes the truths of the world. Okay, it's a kind of what I would call a kind of cognitive seeing as. Okay, so let me just talk about the early Wittgenstein here. This is if you like, the Western philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. Now, he famously, in his earlier work, he thought that the form of a proposition so a proposition would be something like the statement that there are stars, well, the proposition that's contained in the statement that there are stars. The logical form of that proposition isn't something that, as it were, is said by the proposition that there are stars. That there are stars has a logical form to it, that it has predicate, that it has a subject, there's a predicate. It has a particular kind of logical form, but that's not something that's said, that's represented by the proposition itself. It somehow just shows itself. Okay. So to give you a trite example, and here's why I've got that picture there on the slide. So when you look at a painting, the painting has a particular form. And we look at it and we know that it's a painting. But the painting doesn't somehow represent within the painting the fact that it's a painting. It just the form that it's a painting just shows itself. It doesn't. The Mona Lisa doesn't have a little box in the corner that says, "Oh, and I'm a painting." Doesn't have, not always does it have. Would a painting have the painter somehow depicting themselves in it to show to tell you that it's a painting? The form of it just shows itself. Okay. Now, when we think, so I think then we can extrapolate this thought. So I think that there's something right that Wittgenstein talks about, that the form of a proposition isn't something that is said, but it somehow shows itself, and that therefore isn't something that is itself in proposition. It can be that is in the proposition. So it's not something that then can be true or false. So if we think about we can think of one proposition that we can test against the evidence, that there is a God, or that's a proposition that we perhaps test against the evidence. Okay. That there are humans, you name it. All the different propositions that there are in the world, there are infinite many. Now, there is a relationship between them. If you put them all together into a set, there will be a relationship between them. And how they hang together, as it were, can't be itself another proposition. Otherwise, you have to put that proposition back into the set of all propositions. Right? So if you think of all the propositions in the world and you put them in a set, and you think, how do they hang together? What's the structure of all those propositions? You can't put that be in a proposition, because otherwise you have to put it back in the bag, and then you can ask the question again, what's the structure of all those propositions of the world? And so on ad infinitum. So the structure, how the propositions of the world hang together, has to be something that's non-propositional. And because it's something that's non-propositional, it's something that cannot be true or false. Okay, so this is part of the narrative picture I'm talking about. So I think for Al-Farabi then, what's in prophecy then, it's a combination of propositions about the world and the way that propositions hang together. Okay. And so, okay, now for Farabi, and this is typical of the Falsafa tradition, that they want to try to understand in a way naturalistically, sort of semi-scientifically, how prophecy was possible. And the way they think about it is that they say that, I think this, and again, this is quite typical for that tradition, that really what marks out the prophet from more ordinary humans, is that they have an enhanced power of the imagination. Okay. Now, for Farabi, the enhanced power of the imagination. Now, I'll give you a quick example of how the imagination might work. Okay, so when we're thinking about grasping a priori truths, such as that the essence of a house is to provide shelter. Think of what is really the essence of houses, of homes? What is it to be a home? And you can think of, well, I know I've come to terms with the thought that really what it is to be a home is that it's something that provides shelter. But before getting to that, I might imagine what it would be like for a house to be, you imagine a little house and you can imagine it without a roof, yeah, or you can imagine it being built of mud, etc., etc. And it's those things that enable you to suddenly grasp, yes, the essence of houses is to provide shelter. And similar, it might be the case when we're thinking about abstract mathematics, such as 2 and 2 is 4. That the imagination does some sort of preparatory work to then get us to see these a priori truths. So the imagination is very crucial here. So if you've got a very enhanced, powerful, enhanced faculty of the imagination, so the thought goes was for Farabi, was that the Prophet wasn't just able to see one a priori truth at the time. So it's very difficult for us to have the a priori intuition say that everything is self-identical and that one and one is two all at once. If you try and do that, it's really, really difficult. But for the Prophet, by the Prophet having this enhanced power of the imagination, not only could they see multiple, have the primary intuition for multiple so-called Aristotelian intelligibles, these a priori truths, but they can do them all at once. Okay, so they could see all the truths of the world, the fundamental truths of the world would come to them all in one moment. Okay, and so they can see how, so the point would be is that they understand then, because they see how all the truths are connected up, and they see all of that in one moment, they understand the world better than everybody else. And of course, this is of a piece with Neoplatonism that the Falsafa had inherited from people like Plotinus and Proclus, etc., that there was a kind of emanationist metaphysics where one starts in a kind of Big Bang moment where there's pure unity in the world, and as it were, as the world gets more and more corrupted, and we get to our world, we find more and more division. But ultimately, everything, the fundamental nature of everything is unified, and you have this kind of unity of knowledge. So the further we understand the world, the more we really understand that everything is connected. So the point is, what's prophecy is not just individual propositions, but it's a picture of how the different propositions of the world hang together. And the Prophet, because he understands, sees all the truths at once, understands how they're all connected up. So this means that every individual proposition in prophecy can be tested against the evidence. So everything that's in the Quran, you can test against the evidence and verify whether or not it's true. But nonetheless, there's something epistemically unique about prophecy. Okay? What marks out the Prophet is the epistemic state of understanding. Okay? So let me just give, so the difference between the Prophet and our state isn't just about the knowledge that we have, but it's how they understand those truths. So here's an example. So the organizers of our workshop today, they believed truly, they had knowledge that the lecture today would start at 3 o'clock Kuala Lumpur time, right? And we all knew that because we all arrived here at 3 o'clock. Okay, and we could verify that piece of information, right? We could arrive at 3 o'clock and we could see whether or not it started, individual proposition. Now, I put it to you that our organizers not only knew that this lecture was going to start at 3 o'clock, but they understood that proposition better than the rest of us. They knew what the timetabling facilities were at their home institution, why it had to be at 3 o'clock rather than another time, given different timetable clashes, how that would fit in relative to the UK, what time it is in the UK, etc., etc. So whilst the individual proposition that the lecture will start at 3 o'clock is something that we all can independently verify, our organizers' understanding of that piece of knowledge is different to ours. And so I put it to you that that's something similar to the difference. It's not the same, of course, not at all the same, but something different, something similar to how the Prophet's state of knowledge is something that we can verify, but yet is different to ours. They understand the world better than everybody else. Now, this means that in the Prophet's, what I would think is a state of certainty, by knowing all the different truths, being absolutely sure of all the different truths and knowing how they all hang together, their state of certainty, their state of knowledge, of absolute knowledge, is a composite or a unification of both theoretical perfection, so they know theoretically the truth, and then of practical and rhetorical perfection. So just like we're in this emanationist sequence, the more unified, the more unity we get, the further up the emanationist, the closer we get to the one. So it is here. We can find that with the virtues too. The more unification the virtues are, the more we're approaching the one. So in the Prophet's state of certainty, we've got a unification here. Why? Because their absolute state of certainty, which is grounded on not only knowing the truths of the world, but understanding why they are such that they are, because they get them all at once and they have this complete picture of how the truths hang together. They necessarily then have a practical and rhetorical skill. That is, they know how the truths of the world are all ultimately fundamentally connected. So they'll know how to explain quantum mechanics in something as trivial as what you had for breakfast this morning, because they know all those different connections. So that gives them perforce enormous rhetorical facility. And they'll be able to see the ideal in terms of the non-ideal and enact that in the world. So that gives them the practical perfection. Okay, so now in the Farabian picture, in this conception of knowledge, right, of absolute knowledge and knowing how all the absolute truths of the world hang together, we do get a principle linked between knowledge and rhetorical skill. So that if you were lucky enough in that particular history of meeting the Prophet, it would be impossible for you not to be persuaded by him, because his rhetorical and dialectical skill would be so perfected that not only would he know the truth, he would be able to explain it in the best possible way relative to your specific circumstances, because you'd have such dialectical facility. Okay, now, one of the interesting things here is that this is an absolute state of knowledge, and obviously we don't come close to that. The Prophet has so first of all, we've got this now. We've found, in a way that it was absent in analytic epistemology, this principled skill in this particular state of knowledge, a principled link between theoretical knowledge and rhetorical and dialectical ability. Okay, that was the bit that was missing. Right? Why is it that knowing something equals being able to explain it? In the state of the Prophet, the virtues are so unified that they come together. Okay. Now, but this particular state of knowledge isn't something that's obviously going to be available to everybody else. This is what marks out the Prophet. So we have here, and this is again typical of the Islamic tradition of falsafa, that we get a kind of classification and grades of knowledge that's mirrored in the Arabic for knowledge, which seems to admit of gradations in the way that the English knowledge, interestingly, the English notion of knowledge can't be. So we get this sort of classification. So that we get the absolute knowledge that's available to prophets that's different to the kind of knowledge that's available to humans, to the rest of us humans, right? Not that the prophet's also human, but the prophet has has attained a level of knowledge that is unavailable, and which is why prophecy is epistemically unique, that's unavailable to just any of us individually. But perhaps we can get this there collectively. Okay, now, so here's the position I call Farabian fallibilism, that we have to accept that the state of certainty that's available to the Prophet isn't something that any one of us singularly can attain. We have to accept the fact that each of us individually will never be as certain about anything. We won't get absolute certain about anything in the way that the Prophet can. We will never be absolutely certain, is the thought. Our state of knowledge is always going to be a classification beneath. At best, even the most intelligent of us, any individual will have a state of knowledge that is at best worse than that one of the Prophet. So we might be mistaken. Now, I think that's, to me, an interpretation too of what it is to think of Muhammad as being the seal of the prophets. That, in other words, there will be no other prophet following Muhammad. There'll be no more prophecy. Because this state of knowledge, as in the word, is unattainable by anybody else. And I think this gives rise to me, what's the most political question in the prophecy gives rise to, is that how are we going to conduct ourselves in an age where there is no prophet? When there is a prophet, it's obvious their dialectical and rhetorical skills are so incredible that it's obvious who should lead us. There's no question. And they'll bring harmony to the diverse skills and abilities that are distributed amongst us, and bring harmony to a particular political entity. But when there is no prophet, how should we conduct ourselves? And we know there will never be another prophet. I think that's really the political and theoretical question for us, since none of us as a single individual can attain this certain knowledge. And so in other words, that none of us can get certainty. Okay, so how should we conduct ourselves in a world where none of us individually can attain certainty? And that we should give up the illusion, the attempt to try and find absolute certainty for each of us as individuals. Now, this lesson, I think, is one that's available to all of humanity, and not only those who might call themselves Muslim, or who believe perhaps in the very specific historical Muhammad. Okay. Just to bring this back to what would be analytic epistemology, why that lesson would be available to them too. Because we can think of the Prophet here as what Kant called a regulative ideal. Okay, and I think this is maybe the thought of what it is, the way of thinking about what it is for Muhammad to have been the seal of the prophets. Okay, so Kant talks about a regulatory ideal, such as a perfect circle, that nobody can quite draw a pure perfect circle. But yet the ideal helps us regulate and think about when we've got a better circle than another one. Right? So here again, we've got the ideal of what the prophet's epistemic state is, one where the virtues are unified. None of us can singularly achieve that. It's unachievable. Okay, and we don't have to think, and as I say, we don't necessarily have to think of it. So this lesson was available even for those who don't have to believe in the historical Muhammad. We can think of the ideal is an epistemic state where rhetoric and knowledge are all intertwined. And once we've got that as the ideal, that should guide us to thinking about what the lesser forms of knowledge might be. Okay. And again, the political question of how should we behave how should we organize ourselves in a time when there is no prophet, and that we will always live in a time when there is no prophet. Okay. So that lesson will be available to anybody, because here is the ideal. It's an unrealizable ideal for anybody. But what does that teach us? well, one thing I think it teaches us is that we have to be, is fallibilism, that we have to be content. We have to know our place and be content with knowing with less than full certainty. Now, I want to, just as an aside, I want to put here what I've called there a provocative question. Maybe people can tell me about this in the question and answer, but do you think this is to overly secularize the teachings of the Prophet, to think of maybe what their epistemic state in this regulative as a regulative ideal? Or perhaps is the distinction between the secular and the sectarian in this context already starting to break down? And that the very distinction is brought about really something, it is a kind of Western invention that assumes that the secular can't be in any way public, that it can't in any way be evidentially based. So when we think of Islam, if we interpret Islam in some way evidentially or in some way as a rationalist religion, does it even really make sense to ask about the sectarian secular distinction? And it's perhaps, I put it to you, this is just a question for for the Q&A perhaps, or for further thought, as a provocative one, that is just insisting on the distinction, a kind of covert form of tribalism, because what you're really wanting to find out is whether it belongs to a specific tradition of a group of people, really, rather than it being, as it were, the truth. Okay, I'll put that.
We would like to open I mean, you can continue a little bit more, but we want to open the floor to questions, maybe around 5 more minutes more.
Sure, please. Oh, so, pardon me. So I have 5 more minutes to discuss,
Yeah.
to talk about this. Okay. All right. Okay, I think I've got, I might not get through everything. Okay. So I'll try and get through as quickly as I can. Okay. All right. So those are some questions for the floor too. So that'll be good. That might lead neatly onto that. But I wanted to get onto the contemporary problems. Okay. So here one of the lessons I'm drawing from all of this is that we have to make do with being less than certainty. So when we're facing a world where perhaps our elders or ourselves kind of decry the certainty that we once had, that we had certainty in our beliefs, institutions, curated information, and we knew things. And now we've got too much information, we don't know what to believe, and we lack certainty, and we need to revert back to the position that we found ourselves. Well, for Farabi's response, I think, or we can extrapolate what Al-Farabi's response might be from this, is to think, well, there is a difference between, or he makes us aware of a difference between what you'd call kind of psychological certainty, the feeling of certainty, and actually warranted certainty, being justified in being certain. And that all we really ever had in the past with institutions such as the BBC curating information was just the psychological feeling of certainty. We were just crying really the psychological feeling of certainty, because all the information that seems to be currently more available now didn't just spring into existence. There was always that information there. It just wasn't available to us. So it was always a false sense of certainty. It was a psychological certainty, not really a warranted certainty. And to think of oneself as fully certain is in a way idolatrous. It's to worship false gods, the tribe, the ego, certain knowledge. Okay, I think there's a way of thinking about this in Quranic terms that I'll skip out for now, maybe put that back. Now, one lesson that people have made from some of Farabi's teaching is that, look, what prophecy is for falsafa is that perhaps in the Prophet having this rhetorical facility. Part of what that is to be able to, what prophecy is the truth packaged in a way that the public can understand. So the truth packaged in symbols such that everybody can understand. So God doesn't literally, of course, sit on a throne. That would be to anthropomorphize God, really, if you think about it literally. But it's a symbol of God's majesty to think of him as sitting on a throne. Okay, it's an image that helps us, the masses, understand some fundamental truth. So so if we've got this connection between true knowledge and rhetorical facility and image making, then perhaps we should learn that lesson for today, that somehow our intellectual elite, our intelligentsia, perhaps a liberal elite, needs now forgotten that lesson and that need to get better at getting their message across. Okay, so this was a lesson that someone called Leo Strauss, an American philosopher, that was a Jewish American philosopher that emigrated from Germany. And he took that from reading Falsafa. Now, interestingly, Strauss, some of his students infiltrated the American government and were very influential under George W. Bush, okay, during the time of the Second War in Iraq. Okay, incredibly influential, that somehow it was appropriate to talk about what Plato called the noble lies, that we can invent mythologies that the elite would know were false, but they were serving a better purpose, such as the myth of the United States as a harbinger of peace and prosperity across the world, that the elite would know was a kind of symbol and not really the literal truth, but it was a necessary lie to get the public to understand something fundamental. But the problem is, if that's the lesson that we should take, that the intelligentsia needs to get better at presenting its message across, that it needs to engage in acts of rhetoric, in noble lies, to present its truth, because otherwise they're sitting ducks for the sophists. And Strauss was thinking of the sophists of his day, which were the Nazi Germans. Okay, you can think of today as the populists, who are going to use rhetorical techniques, who are going to engage in counterfeit, okay, to get their message across. If we, the intelligentsia, don't engage in warfare at that level, we're just sitting ducks. We're going to get whitewashed, and the populists, the neo-Nazis, they win. But the problem, and that's a very tempting thought, and one that I think the George Bush administration took to heart, interestingly, as an irony in history. But the question is, what happens when we get found out? When the elite gets found out that they were engaging in these noble lies. There was a quote there from Ibn Sina that just tells us that we should always occult, that the elite should always occult, never tell the public that they're engaging in knowledge that they're occulting from the commonality. But the problem is, what happens if we don't manage and the public discovers that the elite are engaging in noble lies? Then we have a massive crisis, because then it exacerbates the problem of when on who to trust and who to believe. Okay. Now, I think the idea that we've got, hopefully I've got time for one last slide there, a couple of minutes. Hopefully that's okay. Okay. So the idea that there are these noble lies is modeled on the Platonic premise that there are people, individuals, who are certain, the philosopher kings, who can get this grade of certainty, and who then need to persuade the rest of the public of the truths that they are certain of. But I think the Farabian lesson, as I've tried to show today, is that no individual can be fully certain, and that the perfected state of the Prophet where intellectual, rhetorical, and practical virtues are kind of united. Now, when there is no Prophet, those virtues lie fragmented amongst us. Some of us are more intellectually capable in a kind of quantum physics way. Others are more rhetorically gifted, more artistically minded. Others of us are more practically minded, can build things really well. The perfected state that emulates the state of the Prophet is when those three things are kind of working in harmony, when we're working together in a kind of harmony. So that perhaps working as a unity, we can come close to achieving the state of the Prophet. Now, when there isn't a Prophet, though, because the Prophet isn't just the philosopher king, as in Plato, of embodying theoretical perfection, he's a composite of all those three. When the Prophet isn't there, we can't just substitute the rulership, government, to the theoreticians, the philosopher kings. There is nobody there who can take their place. Okay, so we're thinking, and moreover, Farabi also tells us of, he gives us a hierarchy of different political systems that work and don't work. This is the penultimate point of the slide. And he thinks that the very worst political system is one where we've got a kind of, where we believe that we're being ruled by the virtuous, but really we're being ruled by the non-virtues. And the virtuous are the non-virtuous who are now ruling us have got control of all those rhetorical techniques, media, etc. We might put it in a modern context, where we're so brainwashed that we'll never be able to see that the unvirtuous who are ruling us are really the unvirtuous and unvirtuous. And so we will never be able to overturn the non-virtuous from ruling us, because we'll never even be able to grasp the fact that they're not virtuous. So we'll be forever stuck in a terrible political regime. This is the worst possible outcome, thinks Farabi. So here's, I think, a lesson for what we should not do in terms of when we're confronted with what seems to be like an overabundance of information. The temptation is to think that we should create a new system that regulates information, a new system such as the BBC that regulates information, that controls information, that the elite can then control what information goes out to the masses so that the truth comes out for everybody. But that's doomed to fail because it will only exacerbate the problem. The modern day sophists from Plato's time, the populists, etc., will then just be able to emulate those systems to inherit that sense of respectability. I'll end with one just example. A right-wing organization, the right-wing movement in the UK here, some of you may have seen this, have constituted a channel called GB News, where they really propel their kind of populist propaganda. But this news channel looks entirely respectable, okay? It looks on the surface exactly as any other news channel might do, okay? And what they're doing here is, because we attempted to regulate and curate information and give kind of the signs of when these are the sorts of things that you should look at, this is what proper news looks like, yeah, a proper news channel looks like, then the populace can kind of chameleon-like borrow that that system, what that system looks like, to propel their own message. And again, that just exacerbates the problem. So the lesson is, I think, not to try to curate that information in that way. Okay, hopefully I've not spoken over my time too much. Thank you so much for listening, and I'd be fascinated to take some questions now. Thank you. Nurulain?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I had problem with my internet. Okay. We thank you, Professor Anthony. And we have just journeyed through a profound and actually thought-provoking exploration of Islamic philosophy as a living tradition brought to light through the analytic lens by Professor Booth. His lecture reminded us that the legacy of our great thinkers, Kindi al-Farabi, Ibn Sina ibn Rushd, is not confined to dusty manuscripts or historical nostalgia. Rather, their insights confront our present moment, a world plagued by doubt, by information overload, and ideological confusion. And at the heart of today's message is the idea that Islamic thought was never afraid of reason, and in fact, it demanded it. And reason, aql, was not seen as a threat to revelation, but as its companion. And we were reminded that belief to be justifiable and must rest on truth, relevant grounds, and that the prophetic example is not only one of the certainty, but of wisdom, of imagination, of humility combined. And yet a powerful warning was also offered that the illusion of certainty, psychological certainty, is not the same as warranted or truthful knowledge. And in our time, perhaps, is not a loss of certainty we suffer from, but the collapse of false certainties. And this collapse, unsettling as it may be, opens a door towards a more honest, critical, and ethical path forward. Okay, we open the floor to questions, if there is any. We have one here. Let me read. One question here is that, Prof, what is your suggestion of reviving Islamic analytical philosophy in our current context? What role you see for it now?
What role do I see for?
But what is your suggestion of reviving Islamic analytical philosophy in our current context, and what role you see for it now? What is the role of Islamic analytical philosophy?
Okay, so I think it's, first of all, I think it's something that's for everybody. So I don't think it's just for, so one of the things I was trying to get across, I don't think it's just for an elite. I think one of the thoughts here is that absolutely everybody should be able to, in whatever language they speak, engage in the tradition and to think for themselves, engage in the text, not just as what is the correct historical analysis of this? How do I open up the text philologically? What is the correct interpretation for every word that we see, that we read here? Now, I think there is some, because of course, what I don't want to say is that there isn't value in that kind of scholarly work, right? Contextualizing it, doing the sort of philological analysis of that. And I think there's some people that are really good at doing that, and they're doing phenomenal work. But for something for the public, I don't think we need that. I think it can be available to everybody to engage in these texts and to really think through for themselves some of the lessons that are in there, because I think in doing so, that stuff, it becomes alive today. So that so that's my answer to that. I think is that it's my main thing is it's for everybody. It's for every single person.
We have some in Zoom. Anyone wants to ask? Straightforward to.
Yeah, there are many questions there.
Okay, William M. Watt also held that Prophet Muhammad's experience of revelation was a psychological experience. Okay. Sir, in your book, Analytic Islamic Philosophy, you make a good case for why Islamic rational arguments can be understood via analytical philosophy. In your opinion, is the Anglo-American analytic tradition in philosophy soon to be superseded by other trends in the near future? If so, how would you like to see researchers react to that in terms of appreciating the complexities of Islamic rational argumentation?
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you. So now, so I didn't get into this too much, but I think so. Analytic philosophy, as a tradition, began in the kind of 20th century. Um, in my view, I think a lot of it was a reaction to to the aftermath of the Second World War, and thus to some fascistic tendencies. Okay, and it was attempting to be an antidote to that by putting in philosophy the primacy of kind of science and especially mathematics, especially through the works of Bertrand Russell. So Bertrand Russell. Okay, now. And sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, there's a kind of I find there's a temptation to think that there's a kind of similar impulse in maybe some of the Mutasili thought, in some of falsafa, that there is a kind of congruence with rational argumentation and mathematics, a kind of role for science, for thinking of the religion in terms of a sort of scientific basis. And that I think that there's a kind of there's a kind of symbiosis there. And that I find that tempting. As I mentioned, I think once something about Islamic art that's so given toward mathematics, and of course the huge role of mathematics in Islam as a tradition in general, sometimes makes me think about those things. But actually, I have to resist that temptation because I think that the analytic movement as it is so disparate now. It's impossible to give you, in terms of kind of necessary and sufficient conditions, a definition of what the analytic movement is. Could it be logical positivism? From within the analytic tradition, people like Quine, etc., reversed and criticized the logical positivisms. Okay, then there were different movements about the conceptual turn from Davidson. Then there was the linguistic turn, sort of neo-Wittgensteinians. There's so many different methodological stances one can take from within the analytic tradition. Now, I kind of take that as maybe rightly. So there's just not really one thing that the analytic tradition is about beyond a kind of style of writing, an attempt to make one's results as visible to as wide a people as possible, to make them as testable as they possibly could be, right? To write clearly in such a way that one's findings are understood by as many people as possible. I think that would be the only thing that really characterizes the analytic tradition, and such that it's forever in a way trying to reinvent itself and take on new forms. And I think we're seeing very much today within the analytic tradition an attempt to reinvent itself to be more open to traditions that occupy not just the Western sphere, to not just the Islamic tradition, but other non-Western traditions. So I take that to be a good thing, that the analytic tradition has been such that it can continually be reinventing itself and move toward progress, so that it isn't this kind of ossified bone, made into kind of solid tradition that can then be dispatched or not, depending on whether you accept its methodological principles. It's always in a period of reinventing itself, as I believe, humbly, that I think the Islamic tradition is in that, it has that kind of characterization too, that it's forever in a sense, is capable of always being reinventing itself. Okay, so I think just in response to the last point of the question is, I think the question is, for me, from somebody that's in the West, is how does the analytic tradition, which is kind of perhaps the more primary one in the Anglo-American world, the Western tradition, how do we engage with those traditions that have been different from ours in a way that's respectful, that doesn't fall under the traps of being covertly Orientalist, right? We're aware of the dangers of Orientalism, How do we evade that? How do we engage in this material in a way that's maximally respectful, still and learn from it, and don't inadvertently transmit negative ideologies? So I think that that'll be the central difficulty that we need to engage with. Okay, sorry, I'll stop talking. The next question. Hope that helps.
We have a lot of questions. I think we'll send them to Prof actually, and we have to end right now. And we have actually a virtual certificate to give to you, since this is virtual, and we thank you very much. Brother Musamil, can we show that to him? Okay.
Oh, how lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, absolutely wonderful. Absolutely wonderful.
So, yeah, Prof, please, you want to add something?
Yeah, okay. Let me first once again express my gratitude to Professor Anthony for this excellent lecture. In fact, he covered many topics and issues in just 1.5 hours or less than that. He took us in all this roads and streets and deep caves of philosophy, whether from some Western perspective and from Islamic perspective. I think it was really something wonderful, very appreciative. We have this is the number 33 professorial lecture. I attended all of them. I trust and believe this is one of the best of those professorial lectures that we have heard. And I think the frameworks you put, the ideas, the challenges, the questions will result in more ideas and thought and engagement. I wish and believe we hope to see you coming in here to our university for visiting maybe professor for a period of time, so that you can share more great ideas and views. And I think we have also from our side many views on what you have mentioned, but we need more time to come together and engage and learn from one another. The way how you articulated some ideas of the Islamic philosophy, classical Islamic philosophy, really amazing. And this is why we really thank you for all this great effort and for your lecture. It's recorded and we will send to you a copy, and also the original certificate. Somehow we will be sending it to you, and we hope to see you contributing more and more to our discourse here. We have many professors here, many scholars, and in the YouTube channel, and also many people follow our professorial lecture and they listen to it and they comment and they give their inputs and views. Once again, Professor Anthony, thank you very much indeed for your presence and your contribution to our professorial lecture.
Thank you. I'm so humbled, and thank you all for your time and listening. I wish I had more time to discuss your questions. And inshallah, maybe I will see you in the future.
Wonderful. In fact, we have many questions in the Zoom, and also I received to my WhatsApp many. I will forward them all to you. Some of the people here, I think, read already a copy of your book. They have many things to engage with your side. And I would like to, in the end of this professorial lecture, once again, to thank all the participants, the scholars, the researchers, those who followed us from many parts of the world. Thank you very much indeed for your time, presence, and participation here. We will continue our engagement, bringing great scholars, great philosophers, and building the bridges and giving opportunities to all scholars, Muslims and non-Muslims, to put forward their ideas so that we create more inclusive narratives and sharing common grounds. We know that we differ in many perspectives, in many things, but what is important is that mind of engagement, mind of dialogue. And for your information, Professor Anthony, and the people with us here, our university is deeply and extensively currently championing Tawhidic epistemology in a very integrated manner, engaging scholars. So with this, I once again thank everybody, and may God bless you all, and we will keep in touch. And I can say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Once again, a great thank you to Brother Abdul Rahman, the great